Hello everyone, it's a pleasure to make your acquaintance and welcome to my 5.5 Part 2 Imaginarium Theater guide. Before, I used to just do a 4-star walkthrough, and I still plan to do that, but with the upcoming changes to Imaginarium Theater to give you more rewards in June in the form of resin and elixirs to craft custom artifacts, I wanted to test the waters in making a more detailed guide for theater, so any feedback on the formatting or video in general is super appreciated. Now to outline the video, I'm not going to go through every single enemy you'll face and every act. I plan to instead go through the elements and the characters you're taking, then go through some general theater tips, then talk about the bosses that everybody faces at 3, 6, 8, and 10, maybe my preferred enemy choices in the stages in between, and definitely talking about the Monolith stage, and lastly talking about which characters are important to save up for those specific stages. So this season we have Cryo, Hydro, and Geo. That means we have access to 2 crystallized reactions, Freeze, and Shatter. Now because the buffing system is generally centered around the direct reactions, so the crystallizes and the freeze, Shatter's not really a supported element, so you won't be able to get any theater buffs specifically centered around that reaction. Let's take a look at the resonances as well. Hydro resonance will give you HP. That will be useful for Hydro characters, but not really useful for anyone else apart from Hu Tao and Shinobu. Cryo resonance gives you 15% crit rate to enemies that are frozen or affected by cryo. This is useful to a lot of characters, although keep in mind that for acts 8 and 10, as you're facing bosses can't be frozen. Instead, what will happen on these enemies is it will consume the Hydra and the cryo on the enemy to freeze them, and then those elements will just disappear because the enemy won't be frozen. For Geo Resonance, while you're shielded, you get a free 15% damage to all damage types. So only the active character can make use of this, but it's very easy to get your hands on and it's universally buffing your team. On top of this, when you do damage to enemies while shielded, they also have lower Geo resistance. So none of these reactions benefit really at all from Elemental Mastery apart from maybe Shatter on Geo characters. But talking about characters, let's have a look at the characters. I want to go over the starting characters, some brief certain key notes about characters, and the special invitation one. I'm not going to go through every character, but any that stand out in a really good or bad way I'll make points of. But later, when we go to look at the acts themselves, I'll also mention their specific characters you should be saving for those acts. So it's probably important to watch the video all the way through before deciding which characters to pick when. The first 6 characters we'll take a look at are the mandatory opening characters. Nevertheless first, Nevertheless is a bit limited in this theater because you can only trigger 2 reactions, at least with Cryo and Geo in the team. Nevertheless gets more damage on his charge stack if you trigger 3 Hydro reactions with different elements. At C1 you get 1 pre-stack of this, so this won't matter for him. It's worth remembering here that you're limited. You can take special invitation characters to get those reactions, but then you're forced to run them with him, and we'll talk about why the special invitation characters aren't great to take in the general tips section. The other way you can get around this though is if an enemy has an aura, in which this abyss you do come across quite a few. Next we have Candace, who's just a normal attack buffer. She can apply good amounts of Hydro at C6, and she can also give your characters a Hydro infusion. The next character, Ayaka, is one of the better characters this Imaginarium Theater. This is because she synergizes really well with the freeze reaction. Her best teams are generally freeze team, and along with that, the freeze reaction is a great way to CC enemies and stop them taking actions, whether that's because you're fighting multiple of them at once or you want to stop them from doing damage to you. Because in theater there's not many bosses you're facing, freeze is much more prevalent. We have Charlotte, who's a reliable healer, and Albedo, who's a little older but can still do reasonable off-field damage, and lastly we have Kachina, who's one of the few Natlan characters you'll have access to this theater. For special invitation characters we have Venti, Hu Tao, Shinobu, and Kave. Venti is definitely the most valuable among these characters, mainly because in theater you often come across combat scenarios where you're fighting multiple groupable enemies. Tao using Hydro and Cryo characters can melt and vaporize quite easily, but those reactions she's triggering won't be beneficial to the buffs. Now what about the rest of the roster you have access to? We'll start off looking at some of the stronger characters you can pick. Zitlali is going to be a great character because not only does she reduce enemies' resistance to Hydro damage, but she's often put on the scroll set, which will buff Hydro and Cryo damage if she triggers a freeze. Shenhe is one of the few characters that's able to provide resistant shred to Cryo itself, and Shenhe is able to buff a lot of Cryo damage dealers. Zhongli and Jilin in their kit have abilities to reduce resistances to Hydro and Cryo, and Zhongli's also works for Geo. Navia generally wants a perfect mix of non-Geo characters and Geo characters, and so it's easy to get other Geo characters in your team to trigger those crystallizers, so she's one of the most valuable damage dealers for this theater. Chiori, along the same lines, also wants Geo characters in her team, preferably with Geo construct. Farina is an amazing all-round buffer and can have substantial damage as long as you have another healer in your team. And the Imaginarium Theater will give you HP buffs, making it easier to get to that 40,000 HP threshold. On the weaker side of characters, we've already mentioned Novelet. Not that he's particularly weak, it's just harder to get the most out of him, but Mualani is a Vapor-reliant damage dealer. But because you only have Hu Tao as a pirate character you can bring, it's going to be a lot harder to trigger Vaporizers, so you can either completely avoid Elemental Mastery or only play her in times when you're fighting enemies that have a Pyro aura. The same conditions apply to Wriothesley and Ganyu if they were looking for melt teams, and same for Child. Those characters are a bit more flexible and therefore not as weak when you're not triggering amplifying reactions. Not only do we not benefit from Shatter, but a lot of Cryo characters are designed around physical damage and you can't trigger Superconduct apart from with Kuki, meaning Fremine, Eula, and anyone else you wanted to play around physical damage won't benefit as much. Lastly, we have Nilou. Nilou is designed as a bloom damage dealer, so the only time you'd be able to use that is if you brought Kave. Then you're bringing a team that's entirely Dendro and Hydra, meaning you wouldn't be able to trigger any of the reactions that you get buffs from this theater. Okay, that should be most of the characters covered. Let's take a look at the general tips. This is something that I want to go through every Imaginarium Theater and just point out some general things which are helpful to know. So firstly, borrowing characters from a friend. If you can borrow a character, do it. You can either take them because they're a really strong, well-invested character, maybe you just want to try one out, or you have a problem specifically with a certain boss you need solving. It'll make your run a lot easier. You can find a bunch of friends on Discords or Reddits, or even just looking through the co-op list and adding people with cool characters. Something else that's very important to note is how the blessings levels work. So in Imaginarium Theater, the opening cast characters get 20% attack, 20% defense, and 20% HP for free, which is a nice little boost. But normally you're given a range of number of characters you could bring. For the hardest difficulty, this is between 22 and 26. And for every character over the minimum amount you take, so for the hardest difficulty, every character over 22 you take, you get a free blessing level. Every blessing level gives all the characters you're bringing extra stat. Every level you get 800 HP, 50 attack, 50 defense, and 20 elemental mastery. And this increases in level every time you pick a buffing card. That means if you have 2 of each of the reaction buffs and you started with those 4 bonus characters, you're getting 10 levels. That means 8,000 HP, 500 attack, 500 defense, and 200 elemental mastery, so you get a lot of stats. And that's buffed even further for the special invitation characters. Because they don't work with the elemental system and you can't get those special reactions, they're given double the amount of blessing level stats. So they'd get 16,000 HP, 400 elemental mastery, etc. Special invitation characters, I said I'd talk about this earlier, don't really benefit your teams in the later stages. This is because the special invitation characters aren't the elements that are included in the theater, and so any of those buffs you're taking that are centered around specific reactions, these characters won't be able to interact with, meaning that even if characters are able to access certain archetypes that make them strong, they won't be getting the rest of the buffs you've already gained. Though as we mentioned, characters like Venti will be universally helpful just because their kit is very useful, and they won't stop you from doing certain reactions. Next is mystery caches. I highly recommend taking mystery caches if you have the option to. That's because most of these mystery caches are normally weighted in your favor. You could get a free 90 currency, the Fantasia flowers, or 15 extra after every combat. Or even a rare occurrence where you're able to give vigor energy back to characters so they can appear again in your teams, and maybe you get that on a really essential character. Lastly, a general tip about the buffs is that all the buffs are generally quite universal. Whether you're picking healing or resistant shred or instant damage, it doesn't really make too much difference. It all rewards a similar amount in the end. The only condition being that if you have a lot of cryo characters, pick the cryo buffs. It's fairly intuitive. Okay, that's the general tips. Let's take a look at the acts. So as you can see, there's quite a few options for this first act. I prefer to take the mechs or the rune machines. This is because apart from physical resistance, they don't generally have any other special resistances, whereas the Hydro Slams have Hydro immunity. They also have pretty basic mechanics versus something like a Wayob that will drain your energy. In Act 2, my favorite enemy to pick is the Avatar of Lava. This is because it has a constant pyro aura, meaning if you take cryo characters or Hydro characters, they get free amplifying reactions on it. The cost here is that you're not able to trigger reactions that give you the buffs, but because it's an early stage, it's unlikely you'll have acquired a lot of buffs yet. Something that I want to point out for Act 1 and 2 is Act 1 and 2 are usually pretty easy. They have low level enemies. This means ideally you shouldn't be picking your strongest characters in these chambers, and you should be saving them for later on. Seeing weaker characters also means those weaker weaker characters won't reappear later and you won't have to use them on an important chamber. Okay, let's have a look at the first mini-boss in Act 3, which is a local legend. We're facing the automated supercomputing field generator, which is simply the mech that lets you plunge. They will start with a Geo ward on them worth 20 units and have their resistances increased by 200% from base 10 while they have this ward on them. You can break this ward quite easily by taking Geo characters like Zhongli, Claymore characters like Fremine, or simply jumping and plunging with a polearm or a sword user. Once you've broken this ward while they're weakened, if you apply Pneuma to them, it will extend the time before they resummon this ward again by 5 seconds. Characters that have access to Pneuma are Charlotte, Neuvillette, Fremine, and Farina. But either way, you will have about 18 seconds to do as much damage as you can before they summon the ward again. If I had to recommend a character as the most effective here, it would probably be Zhongli, but again, this mechanic isn't too exclusive to certain characters, so as long as you can break the ward in some way, you should be good. A character like Albedo is great to use in this chamber because he applies a bit of Geo damage, but because he's a mediumly tall male, he has very fast plunging animations, and so you can very quickly break that ward with him. In Act 4, you're against the Monolith, and we need to talk about how Monoliths work here. To make sure the enemies don't attack the Monolith, there's a couple of ways of dealing with them. The first way and most obvious way is just to deal with them very quickly, to defeat them very quickly, because that will reduce the timer, but you probably already know that. The more creative ways is maintaining aggro from enemies. By default, those enemies will want to attack the Monolith, but if you're attacking them, you keep them distracted. You can do the same thing with taunts. If you present a taunt for them, they will choose to attack that instead. Also, crowd control them, away from the mechanic, staggering them, or simply freezing them to stop them taking aggressive actions, which is very relevant for this theater. I think the best way to deal with this act, no matter which characters you have, is to pick enemies where there's very few of them at a time. So that's the Avatar of Lava or the Secret Source robots where there's only one of them at a time. This means you can attack them, keep them busy, and they'll be distracted and won't attack the Monolith. But you don't need to be doing lots of damage to them to keep them busy. The Avatar of Lava does move around a little annoyingly, but if you keep attacking it and stay behind it, it will stop it from taking any actions. I much prefer this over, say, the Rune Machines, where there can be 2 or 3 of them at a time and it's very difficult to stop them attacking the Monolith. On Act 5, there's a lot of Hydra immune enemies like the Mimics and the Slimes, and I like to avoid those because I like using Hydra characters. But if you're using exclusively Cryo characters, you can freeze them for free. Preferred enemies to take are the Ruin Machines or the Rift Hounds if I'm using Geo damage. Because they're Geo Rift Hounds, once they've taken damage to Geo, they have much lower resistance to Geo. Next, you're fighting an enemy that we've never seen outside one of the local legend special trials in Nalan, called Potapo's Solidarity. Here you're fighting a Cryo Wayob with a very high health pool, though this Wayob doesn't have the usual energy draining mechanics you'd expect. This Cryo Wayob has 50% resistance to cryo damage, so you don't want to take that as your main source of damage, but there's an important mechanic unique to this local legend. Firstly, at the start of combat, it will do an attack that does about 60% of your character's HP, so this does more damage to higher HP characters. After about 17 seconds into the fight, it will summon a spirit alongside you that has a green health bar, and when you heal your characters, that also heals a spirit. Overhealing counts. You need about 50,000 HP to heal it to max. Once that spirit reaches max HP, it will start attacking the Wayob, and it will do around 30% of the Wayob's health. You can normally trigger this 2 times before the chance for a star disappears, which means you need to do about 30% of the Wayob's health yourself. So while a lot of healers such as Siegeween, Charlotte, Diona can be useful, you'll also need some damage. Alongside that, characters that heal themselves like Ryzie and Neuvillette, that healing also counts for the spirit. The spirit can be damaged, and so if you ignore the healing and the mechanic altogether, it will just disappear after it's taken enough damage, or after about 40 seconds if you haven't healed it to full. For Act 7, my favourite enemies to face are either the Ruin Machines, which is useful to have a ranged character for because of the flying Ruin Hunters. If you have some kind of resistant shred like Jillian or Zhongli, then also the Consecrated Beasts can be fine to fight. This is because none of the Consecrated Beasts are specifically resistant to Hydro, Cryo, or Geo. And then you're onto Act 8, where we're facing the Statue of Marble and Brass, otherwise known as the Legatus Golem. The Golem starts with a very large Geo ward worth 32 units, which is about 1.6 times the ward of the mech that you fought in Act 3. Here you will only have about 13 seconds when it's vulnerable after breaking the ward. The difference here is it has lower resistance while warded, only 90%, not the 200 of the Plunge Mek. While it's lost its ward, it has minus 70 resistance, so your damage is amplified a lot further. Every time it resummons the ward, it will only be worth 50% of the last one, down to 25% minimum. Whereas if you're struggling to break the ward, it will summon a Resonator. Hitting this with 6 separate damage instances punches will cause it to break and do about 6.5 units of damage to the ward. As far as useful characters go, it's very similar to the mech. You'd like Claymore characters and Geo characters, as both of those are really excellent at breaking the Geo ward. Lee is especially good, Navia and Ito as Geo units are really good. On the other hand, if you want to ignore the ward, you can take a lot of resistance shred, and remember this is a boss so it can't be frozen, so sets like Blizzard Strike that depend on the enemy being frozen to get the most stats won't work. In Act 9, a lot of the enemy choices have multiple enemies at once that you're fighting. You'd like characters with good AoE coverage. If you're choosing the Pyro Slimes and Mages, you need very good Hydra application, and if you're choosing the Electro Slimes and Mages, you need very good Cryo application. My preferred choice again here is fighting those Avatars of Lava for those free reactions, because at the same time you're fighting Pyro Whopper Flowers, which means you can get your reaction buffs on the Whopper Flowers, and yeah, still make the use of those free reactions on the Avatar of Lava. Lastly, you're facing a boss that's been in the last 2 abysses, the Secret Source Automaton, or Pillar Automaton as I'll call it from now on. It summons pillars you have to climb. If you want really in-depth details on this boss, I recommend you go and watch one of my previous Abyss guides, and if you're having a lot of trouble with the mechanic of getting up the pillars, I have a whole video dedicated on how to do that with almost any team, whether that's using a character's ability to climb up like Sidlali, or just looking for the special little ledges on the edge to climb up. To go back looking at the general stats, this boss again has pretty high resistances, up at 60%. That's until you meet the main mechanic and it enters its weakened state, where it will then have minus 30% resistance. To make it do the main mechanic faster, you can bring characters that can enter a Night Soul state, but in this theater you're limited to 4 characters, that being Kachina, Sidlali, Mualani, and Jillanen. Jillanen doesn't last in that state for very long unless she's in a mono Geo team, and Kachina's right at the start. Mualani, as we said at the start, doesn't fare great in this theater because she doesn't get any vaporizers, so I highly recommend you save Sidlali for this chamber. She'll make climbing the pillars very easy, allow you to get to that main mechanic faster, and reduce enemies' resistance to Hydra damage. If you can't borrow a Sidlali or don't want to take one or just don't have one, then saving Kachina until the end is also a very viable option. You'll have to save her from all the way at the start. The same point goes for the first few stages where I talked about getting those weaker characters out the way. Save your big damage dealers for the later stages because the enemies have the highest health pools. But after including that, I think that's everything I wanted to cover for this guide. Wanted to try to keep it a lot more basic and refined, so I hope you find this useful. If you want more details or more information, feel free to ask and say, and maybe for the next one I can make it a lot more thorough. Maybe this is just the perfect length for you. Either way, I wish you all the best of luck and have a lovely day. Goodbye!